Have you ever walked down a bustling city street, coffee in hand, completely lost in your own thoughts, and suddenly felt a strange vibration beneath your feet? Maybe it was a subway train or perhaps a heavy truck rumbling by. But what if it was something else? What if, just a few feet below the concrete, there lies a forgotten world? Welcome to our deep dive into the hidden history that is quite literally beneath your feet. Today, we are exploring a topic that sounds like it belongs in a Hollywood thriller, but is completely, undeniably true. We are talking about the secret underground networks of tunnels built by bootleggers during Prohibition. It is absolutely fascinating to think about. When most people imagine the Prohibition era, their minds immediately go to the stereotypical images. They picture glamorous floppers dancing the Charleston in smoke-filled speakeasies, jazz bands playing late into the night, and notoriously ruthless gangsters wielding Tommy guns in the streets of Chicago. But those are just the surface-level stories. The real genius, the true logistical marvel of the 1920s criminal underworld, was happening out of sight. It was happening underground. Bootleggers were not just thugs. They were master organizers and, in many ways, rogue engineers. They built extensive, elaborate tunnel systems to transport massive quantities of illegal alcohol, completely evading the watchful eyes of federal agents. Exactly. The sheer scale of what they accomplished underground is staggering. We are not just talking about a couple of guys digging a shallow trench between two basements. We are talking about highly sophisticated networks spanning multiple city blocks, equipped with ventilation systems, electrical lighting, and even small rail tracks to move heavy wooden crates of liquor. And the most mind-blowing part of all this, a vast majority of these tunnels are still there today. They have been paved over, walled off, or simply forgotten, but they exist. Some are still accessible to urban explorers, while others are continually being discovered by completely surprised construction crews trying to lay new utility pipes. Today, we are going to unpack the engineering of these Prohibition tunnels, pinpoint which cities had the most extensive networks, detail exactly how they moved thousands of gallons of booze, and tell you where you might just find some of these tunnels today. To fully understand why anyone would go through the grueling, incredibly dangerous process of carving out secret subterranean pathways, we have to look at the landscape of America in 1920. The 18th Amendment had just been ratified, and the Volstead Act went into effect, completely banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The federal government, driven by the temperance movement, believed they could legislate morality and sober up the nation. But human nature, as it always does, proved them wrong. The demand for alcohol did not vanish overnight. It simply went underground, both metaphorically and literally. Suddenly, an entirely legal, massive industry was handed over to the criminal underworld on a silver platter, and the authorities were aggressively trying to enforce this new reality. The newly formed Bureau of Prohibition began deploying agents across the country. The Coast Guard was patrolling the waterways, cracking down on the famous rum runners who were smuggling high-quality spirits from the Caribbean and Canada. On the streets, local police and federal agents were setting up roadblocks, raiding warehouses, and smashing perfectly good barrels of whiskey and beer in the gutters, creating literal rivers of alcohol. The risk of transporting liquor above ground became astronomically high. If a bootlegger was caught with a truck full of Canadian whiskey, they didn't just lose the product, they faced severe jail time, the confiscation of their vehicles, and the total dismantling of their operation. The stakes were life and death, or at the very least, immense wealth versus federal prison.
That incredible risk is the exact catalyst that forced the syndicates to innovate. You had major organized crime figures, people like Al Capone in Chicago, Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano in New York, who were running syndicates that pulled in millions of dollars a year. We are talking about illicit empires that rivaled modern Fortune 500 companies in terms of revenue and logistical complexity. They could not afford to have their supply chains disrupted by a random police checkpoint or a nosy beat cop. So they looked at their environment. They looked at the densely packed urban landscapes of the 1920s, with buildings stocked close together and streets teeming with unpredictable variables, and they realized the only safe path was down. They had the capital to hire the best discreet labor, the cash to bribe city officials to look the other way, and the absolute necessity to keep the booze flowing. It was a classic risk management strategy, just applied to organized crime. The initial attempts at hiding the transportation of alcohol were somewhat crude. Bootleggers tried hiding bottles in hollowed-out loaves of bread, under piles of lumber on flatbed trucks, or in the false bottoms of passenger cars. But federal agents quickly caught on to these tricks. The agents became experts at probing cargo and topping on the sides of vehicles to listen for hollow spaces. The bootleggers needed a permanent, invisible highway. If they could connect the basement of a quiet, unassuming residential townhouse directly to the stockroom of a bustling downtown speakeasy, they could move product 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, completely undetected. No trucks, no roadblocks, no suspicious transfers in dark alleys. The tunnel became the ultimate solution to the Volstead Act. Let us start our journey in the undisputed capital of Prohibition-era organized crime, Chicago. When you talk about Chicago in the 1920s, you are talking about the Chicago outfit, and inevitably, you are talking about Al Capone. Capone was a master of logistics, and his operation relied heavily on subterranean movement. One of the most famous examples of this is the Green Mill Cocktail Lounge in uptown Chicago. The Green Mill was a massive hub for Capone's syndicate. It was a place where politicians, celebrities, and mobsters all rubbed shoulders. But beneath the glamour of the jazz performances in the main room, there was a completely different world. Beneath the Green Mill, there was a vast network of tunnels that extended far beyond the building's footprint. These tunnels connected the basement of the club to adjacent buildings and allowed for the seamless, invisible delivery of massive quantities of illicit alcohol. The engineering required to build these tunnels in Chicago is simply astonishing. Chicago is famously built on a swamp. The ground is largely soft clay and waterlogged soil, which makes digging incredibly treacherous. You cannot just take a shovel and start digging a hole in Chicago without the walls collapsing in on you. The bootleggers had to hire professional miners, often out-of-work coal miners from downstate Illinois or Appalachia, who understood structural integrity. They had to heavily shore up the tunnel walls with thick, heavy wooden beams, much like a traditional coal mine. They had to install sump pumps to constantly clear out the groundwater that would inevitably seep into the dirt corridors. This was not amateur hour. This was professional, highly paid, and incredibly dangerous engineering, all done in absolute secrecy under the cover of darkness. And think about the logistics of the excavation itself. How do you dig a tunnel hundreds of feet long right under a bustling city street without anyone noticing? The most pressing issue was dirt disposal. When you dig a tunnel, you displace massive amounts of earth. You can't just leave piles of dirt on the sidewalk. That's an immediate red flag for any passing police officer or suspicious neighbor. The syndicates got incredibly creative. In many cases, they would bag the dirt in heavy burlap sacks and slowly transport it out in the middle of the night, disguised in laundry trucks or delivery vans. In other instances, if they had bribed the right city officials, they would actually tie their illegal tunnel excavations into legitimate city construction projects. They would simply dump their excavated earth into the same piles being created by the city's sewer expansion, completely masking their activities in plain sight.
That level of corruption and coordination is mind-blowing. Let us shift our focus eastward, to New York City. The subterranean landscape of Manhattan is legendary, and during Prohibition, it was practically a Swiss cheese of secret passages. One of the most sophisticated examples ever discovered is the legendary 21 Club in Midtown Manhattan. The 21 Club was the pinnacle of high society speakeasies. It hosted everyone from mayors to wealthy industrialists to Broadway stars. Because of its high-profile clientele, it was a frequent target for federal raids. To protect their incredibly expensive inventory of high-end imported wines and liquors, the owners of the 21 Club commissioned a brilliant architect named Jack Kreenler to design a completely foolproof hidden wine cellar. The result of that commission was nothing short of a mechanical masterpiece. The entrance to the secret cellar at the 21 Club was hidden behind a solid brick wall in the basement. But this was no ordinary brick wall. It was an intricately designed 2.5-ton motorized door that was completely indistinguishable from the rest of the foundation. To open it, you had to know the exact secret mechanism. You had to insert a long, thin wire piece of metal, often described as an ordinary meat skewer, into one specific tiny crack in the mortar between two seemingly random bricks. Pushing that skewer triggered a hidden electrical switch, which engaged a massive, silent motor that slowly swung the massive brick wall open, revealing a cavernous tunnel that led to the neighboring building where the actual liquor was stored. It was James Bond-level gadgetry, decades before Ian Fleming even wrote the books. And it worked flawlessly. The 21 Club was raided multiple times by federal agents who brought axes, sledgehammers, and crowbars. They would tear the main bar apart, smash the walls, and scour the basement, but they never once found the hidden wine cellar. The illusion was perfect. Furthermore, the 21 Club had an ingenious bar setup above ground. In the event of a raid, the bartender could hit a hidden foot pedal behind the bar. This pedal would immediately trigger a mechanism that caused the entire shelving unit holding the liquor bottles to suddenly collapse backward. The bottles would drop down a specially designed chute into the city's sewer system, instantly smashing and washing away the evidence before the agents even made it through the front door. By the time the feds got to the bar, there was nothing but the smell of alcohol and a group of innocent-looking patrons sipping ginger ale. Moving away from the glitz of Manhattan, let us look at the gritty reality of the West Coast. San Francisco and Seattle had incredibly unique relationships with Prohibition tunnels due to their geography and history. Seattle, for example, already had a massive advantage: the Seattle Underground. After the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, the city decided to elevate the street level to prevent future flooding and sewage issues. This created a vast, dark, interconnected network of abandoned storefronts and streets beneath the new modern city. When Prohibition hit, this pre-existing underground city became a smuggler's paradise. Bootleggers did not even have to dig new tunnels. They simply claimed the abandoned subterranean city as their own. They used it to quietly move Canadian whiskey, which was smuggled down the Pacific coast via incredibly fast speedboats, straight into the heart of Seattle's hidden speakeasies. San Francisco had a darker, more complex subterranean history with the infamous Shanghai tunnels, which extended beneath the streets of Portland, Oregon as well. These tunnels originally served a multitude of purposes, some legitimate, like moving goods from the docks directly to hotel basements to avoid street traffic, and some horrifyingly illicit, like the practice of crimping or shanghaiing, where unsuspecting men were kidnapped through trapdoors in saloons and forced into maritime labor. During the 1920s, these extensive, dark and damp tunnel systems were immediately repurposed by bootlegging rings. The proximity to the waterfront was key. A ship could unload illicit cargo in the dead of night straight into a hidden dockside entrance, and the liquor could be transported miles inland completely underground, safe from the harbor patrols and the local police force. The sheer volume of alcohol moved through these coastal subterranean networks is almost incalculable. It is crucial to emphasize the daily logistics of these operations. We're talking about moving thousands of gallons of heavy liquid. A standard wooden barrel of whiskey weighs over 500 pounds. You cannot just carry that down a rickety ladder. The bootleggers installed heavily reinforced freight elevators hidden in false alleyway dumpsters or fake garage floors. Once the barrels were in the tunnels, they often utilized miniature rail systems. They would lay down narrow-gauge tracks, similar to those used in coal mines, and use small, rubber-wheeled carts to push the heavy barrels and crates of bottles in absolute silence. They ran elaborate electrical systems, tapping illegally into the city's power grid, to string up bare incandescent bulbs to light these dark, claustrophobic corridors. They even installed rudimentary ventilation shafts that vented out through fake chimneys or innocuous sewer grates to keep the workers from suffocating in the stagnant underground air. Let us talk about a specific documented incident that truly highlights the scale of these networks. In 1928, federal agents in Los Angeles stumbled upon one of the most elaborate subterranean operations ever recorded on the West Coast. They had been surveilling a seemingly ordinary, quiet suburban dairy farm on the outskirts of the city. After weeks of watching trucks come and go at odd hours, they finally secured a warrant and raided the property. On the surface, it looked like a standard agricultural operation, but during the search, one agent noticed a massive, heavy iron grate hidden under a pile of hay in the barn. When they pulled the grate back, they discovered a concrete staircase leading deep into the earth. What they found below was astounding. It was a fully concrete-lined tunnel, over a mile long, running from the dairy farm directly to a hidden warehouse near the coastline. The tunnel was wide enough to drive a small Ford Model T truck through, and it was filled floor to ceiling with imported scotch and rum. The end of Prohibition in 1933 brought a sudden and dramatic halt to the golden age of bootlegging. When the 21st Amendment was ratified, legally ending the noble experiment, the massive, highly organized criminal syndicates lost their primary source of astronomical income overnight. Suddenly, anyone could walk down the street and buy a beer or a bottle of whiskey in broad daylight. The immediate consequence for the subterranean networks was total abandonment. The syndicates had no use for them anymore. The vast tunnels that cost small fortunes to excavate and fortify were simply left to rot. Generators were shut off, the lighting went dark, and the sump pumps that kept the groundwater at bay fell silent. Within years, many of the tunnels dug through soft soil, particularly in places like Chicago, simply collapsed, leaving nothing but mysterious depressions in back alleys and sudden sinkholes in city streets. But not all of them vanished.
The tunnels that were reinforced with thick brick and heavy concrete, especially those in New York and the pre-existing structures in Seattle and San Francisco, survived the ravages of time. During the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, a fascinating secondary consequence emerged. The federal government, terrified of the threat of nuclear war, began surveying major cities for viable fallout shelters. They quickly rediscovered many of these forgotten bootlegger tunnels. Because they were built deep underground and often reinforced with heavy masonry, they were perfect candidates. Many of the secret pathways once used to smuggle gin and whiskey were quietly restocked with drums of drinking water, Geiger counters, and boxes of survival crackers. It is a profound historical irony that spaces built to defy the federal government were eventually repurposed to protect its citizens in the event of an apocalypse.
Fast forward to the modern era, and these tunnels are still making their presence known, often in the most unexpected and disruptive ways. Every year, construction crews working on modern infrastructure projects, laying fiber optic cables, expanding subway lines, or pouring foundations for new high-rise condominiums, suddenly break through a wall of earth and find themselves staring into a dark, brick-lined void. Just a few years ago in downtown Los Angeles, a crew excavating for a new mixed-use development unearthed a massive vault entirely lined with pristine white subway tile. Inside, they found the rusted remains of heavy iron shelving and dozens of intact dust-covered glass bottles that still smelled faintly of juniper and grain alcohol. The project had to be completely halted for weeks while historians and archaeologists meticulously documented the site, mapping a previously unknown spur of a major 1920s smuggling route. These modern discoveries fuel a massive subculture of urban exploration. There is a whole community of historians, adventurers, and curious locals who dedicate their free time to hunting down these forgotten relics. They pore over century-old city blueprints, cross-reference old police raid records from the 1920s, and map out the discrepancies between the official architectural plans and the actual basements of historic buildings. If you know what to look for, the signs are still there. You might be in the basement of an old restaurant or a historic hotel and notice a strange bricked-up archway that leads to nowhere. You might see a modern concrete wall that doesn't quite match the surrounding century-old stone foundation. Or you might find an unusually thick, heavy iron door in a subterranean boiler room that is sealed shut with layers of rust and paint. These are the scars of the Prohibition era, the physical evidence of a hidden war fought beneath the sidewalks. For those listening who want to find a piece of this history themselves, there are actually incredible opportunities to do so legally and safely. Many cities have recognized the immense historical and cultural value of these tunnels and have preserved them as educational attractions. In Seattle, you can take guided tours to the sprawling subterranean network of the underground, walking exactly where the bootleggers walked. In Chicago, while many of the dirt tunnels have collapsed, certain historic bars like the Green Mill still proudly showcase their subterranean entrances and the trapdoors used by Capone's men. Even in small towns across the Midwest, local historical societies are constantly unearthing old brick-lined paths connecting historic pharmacies, which often sold medicinal alcohol during Prohibition, to the basements of long-gone speakeasies. The history is truly all around us, waiting beneath a layer of asphalt and concrete. The story of Prohibition is often told through the lens of what happened in the public eye, the spectacular police raids, the dramatic courtroom trials, and the glamorous parties that defined the Roaring Twenties. But the true mechanical and logistical genius of the era was buried deep beneath the surface. The bootleggers were ruthless criminals, yes, but they were also visionaries of subterranean engineering. They conquered the dark, damp earth beneath our cities to keep an empire of illicit spirits flowing against all odds. So the next time you are walking down a historic city street, listening to the muffled sounds of the subway, or feeling a strange rumble beneath the pavement, take a moment to look down. Remember that just a few feet beneath your shoes, there might be a forgotten brick tunnel, silent and dark, holding the echoes of a time when the entire country went dry, and the underworld responded by building a secret kingdom in the shadows. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden history beneath your feet, and we will see you next time. We left off discussing the sheer scale of the bootlegging operations, but now we have to look at the actual cities where these underground labyrinths were most prominent. Chicago is the obvious starting point. When people think of Prohibition, they think of Al Capone, and Capone was an absolute master of the underground. He really was. Underneath the streets of Chicago, especially around the Lexington Hotel, which was his headquarters, there was a vast network of secret passageways. These were not just dirt paths dug with shovels. We are talking about brick-lined, reinforced tunnels with electrical lighting and ventilation systems. They connected the hotel to nearby brothels, speakeasies, and even transit lines. It is wild to think about the logistics of building that right under the noses of the authorities.
How do you excavate tons of earth without anyone noticing? That brings us to the engineering aspect of these tunnels. Bootleggers often hired unemployed coal miners. They paid them top dollar to apply their mining expertise in an urban environment. Exactly. They would start in the basement of a legitimate front business, a bakery, a laundry service, or a warehouse. They would break through the foundation walls and start digging laterally. To hide the dirt, they would pocket it into crates labeled as legitimate goods and ship it out on delivery trucks, or they would dump it directly into the municipal sewer systems. Dumping it into the sewers was a genius, albeit destructive, move. It washed the evidence right out into the harbor or the river. And once the tunnel was dug, they had to shore it up. They used heavy timber framing, similar to what you would see in a deep coal mine in Appalachia. Then came the masonry. Brick and mortar were brought in silently during the dead of night. And let us not forget the plumbing. These bootleggers were moving thousands of gallons of liquor. Carrying it in glass bottles or heavy wooden barrels through a narrow tunnel was inefficient. So in many cases, they literally built underground pipelines. They ran heavy metal pipes through the tunnels and pumped the alcohol directly from a hidden distillery into the basement of a speakeasy blocks away. Pumping whiskey through city blocks like it is municipal water. That is just astonishing. New York City had a similar setup, but their underground geology presented totally different challenges. Manhattan is essentially a giant slab of solid schist. You can't just hand dig through Manhattan rock with a pickaxe. You need dynamite. And blasting dynamite under a densely populated city is incredibly risky. Which is why the New York bootleggers got creative. Instead of carving out entirely new tunnels through solid bedrock, they hijacked existing infrastructure. They took over abandoned coal chutes, old subway maintenance shafts, and forgotten utility vaults. They mapped out these existing subterranean cavities and then built short connecting tunnels to link them together into a continuous smuggling route. The legendary 21 Club in New York is the perfect example of this ingenuity. They had a hidden wine cellar that was an engineering marvel. The door to the cellar weighed 2.5 tons, but it was perfectly balanced on custom hinges so that a single person could push it open. And it was disguised to look exactly like the surrounding concrete foundation wall. If federal agents raided the club, the bartender would press a secret button. This would trigger a complex system of pulleys and electrical switches. The shelves holding the liquor would automatically tilt backward, dropping all the bottles down a hidden chute where they smashed on the rocks below. The alcohol would drain away into the city sewer, leaving no evidence for the feds. It is like something out of a spy movie, but it was real. Now, let's head over to the West Coast. San Francisco had its own unique underground world. The Barbary Coast was notorious even before Prohibition, but once the alcohol ban hit, the underground network went into overdrive. San Francisco already had a history of secret tunnels dating back to the gold rush. They did. There were the infamous Shanghai tunnels, which were originally used to kidnap sailors. During Prohibition, these older tunnels were modernized and repurposed for smuggling Canadian whiskey that came down the coast. The bootleggers in San Francisco also had to deal with the threat of earthquakes, so their tunnels had extra reinforcement. They used thick concrete archways designed to withstand seismic shifts. That is fascinating. So the engineering adapted to the geography. In Chicago, it was deep dirt and clay. In New York, it was solid schist in existing infrastructure. In San Francisco, it was strong concrete and repurposed historical shafts. This really highlights the vast amount of money at stake. You don't build massive secret tunnels unless the return on investment is absolutely astronomical.
The profits were staggering. We are talking about millions of dollars a week in modern currency. With that kind of money, you can bribe police officers, city planners, and even the guys who draw the official city blueprints. Many of these bootleg tunnels were actually disguised as legitimate utility expansions. Corrupt city officials would sign off on fake permits for sewer line repairs. That explains why so many of these tunnels vanished from the historical record. They were never officially recorded as what they truly were. Which brings us to a really exciting part of this history. What happened to all these tunnels when Prohibition ended in 1933? The alcohol started flowing legally again, and the massive profit margins disappeared overnight. Did they just collapse? Some of them did collapse due to neglect. Water damage, shifting soil, and modern construction projects destroyed many of the shallow tunnels. But a surprising number of them survived. Because they were built with such high-quality materials, many of the deeper brick and concrete tunnels are still down there. They are sitting completely silent beneath the chaotic, noisy streets of our modern cities. And some of them are still being discovered today, right? I read a story recently about a construction crew in Los Angeles.
They were excavating a site for a new high-rise building downtown. About 20 feet down, their excavators hit a solid brick wall. They broke through it and found a perfectly preserved tunnel running for 3 city blocks, lined with empty wooden barrels. Yes, those discoveries happen more often than you would think. City planners are frequently caught off guard because these structures are not on any modern municipal maps. When they find them, construction usually has to halt, while historians and structural engineers come in to assess the site. Sometimes they find vintage glass bottles, old tools left behind by the miners, and even ledger books. Finding an old ledger book would be the ultimate treasure. Imagine seeing the daily records of a massive smuggling operation. But let us talk about the tunnels that everyday people can actually see. If I'm a history buff listening to this podcast and I want to walk through a real Prohibition tunnel, where can I go? Are any of these spaces open to the public? Absolutely. There are a few famous spots that have embraced their shady past. In Los Angeles, the King Eddie Saloon still has access to the old subterranean smuggling routes. Down in the basement, you can see the sealed brick archways that used to connect to a sprawling underground network spanning much of downtown. And then there's the famous underground city located in Seattle. Oh, the Seattle Underground is legendary. It's a bit different because it was originally the street level of the city before it was raised due to flooding, but bootleggers absolutely took advantage of those abandoned lower streets. Walking through there today gives you a genuine eerie sense of what it felt like to conduct illicit business in the damp, dark shadows of a city. It really does. Savannah, Georgia also has a fantastic hidden network. Beneath the historic district, there are tunnels connecting the old riverfront warehouses to the local bars and mansions. They were originally used for various maritime trades, some quite dark, but during the 20s they became the primary arteries for moving illegal moonshine and rum smuggled in from ships anchored off the Atlantic coast. So the best way to find them is to look for historical tours in older cities, especially those on the coasts or major rivers. But what about the urban explorers, the people who want to find the undocumented spaces? I know there's a whole subculture of people dedicated to mapping out these forgotten subterranean realms. How do they actually track down an undiscovered tunnel? It requires a lot of archival research. Urban explorers don't just wander around in the dark. They spend hours in municipal archives looking at property records from the 1920s. They look for anomalies. Why would a small neighborhood bakery suddenly purchase heavy industrial ventilation equipment? Why did a clothing store have a water bill that was 10 times higher than the surrounding businesses? Those are the historical breadcrumbs. They follow the money and utility bills to find hidden excavation sites.
Exactly. Once they identify a suspected front, they check the basement layouts. Often, they find newer brick walls completely ignoring the original foundation plan. Behind that mismatched masonry, the dark, forgotten corridors of the Prohibition era are just waiting to be explored. It is a thrilling mix of detective work and modern urban archaeology.